to introduce Dr. Allison Kidder, who's our speaker tonight. She began actually as a technical writer in managed healthcare before going back to college and getting a BA at San Jose State in environmental education. And she says she saw a ceanothus flower under a microscope and knew that she needed to study plants. And that was the beginning of a long and productive career, which took her then for an MS to San Jose State, the same institution, and where she researched germination success and the restoration potential of Streptanthus albidus in serpentine grasslands in northeast Santa Cruz Mountains, and also studied how rare plants are managed in California. She then went on to a PhD in plant ecophysiology from UC Berkeley's Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management, where she shifted from rare plants to common plants. In fact, one of the most common plants in California, Coyote Brush, Baccharis pilularis. And she also researched drought tolerance and seasonal water use by very different Baccharis pilularis morphotypes and age classes in field and greenhouse experiments, and spent many hours communing with coyote brush and grasses on Mount Tam and Bodega Marine UC Reserve. And she received a research grant from Marin CNPS, which helped to cover the costs of processing isotope samples in that research. After completing her PhD, and some of you may know her from her role as the director of the UC Berkeley's Point Reyes Field Station, where she was the director for 5 years, and actually started up the field station as the leader and supported research and educational programs on Point Reyes, National Seashore, and GGNRA. She also served as on the Science Advisory Committee for Tamales Bay Foundation and as a member of the Watershed Council. Currently, she's the managing editor of the quarterly publication of the East Bay Regional Park's Botanical Garden. I still think of it as Tilden Botanical Garden. And I have to say that the publication Manzanita is one of my very favorite botanical, horticultural, native publications. I encourage you to take a look at it. She also consults with the Moraga Orinda Fire District on coyote brush management, and is on the board of the Ancient Forestry Society and does freelance science writing. So it's with great pleasure to turn the program over to you, Alice.
Wow, thank you for that introduction, Dave. Appreciate it. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to sing the praises of Coyote Brush with all of you tonight. And I feel it's the unsung hero of our coastal plant communities. So without further ado, let me share my screen. And so my talk today will be about coyote brush, Baccharis pilularis, and how to make an argument that I believe it's the keystone species of the coastal scrub, and I would say coastal grasslands as well. But before I dive into my talk proper, I'd first like to investigate what is in the name Baccharis pilularis. So the name Baccharis derives from Bacchus, seen here on the left. He's the Roman god of vegetation, wine, and fertility. And let's see. Also, there's the word bacchanal, as in this 1525 painting by Titian, and of the bacchanal of the Andrians. And bacchanals are often considered crazy parties with lots of wine and fertility goings on. So you might ask, how might this all relate to Baccharis? Well, so Baccharis is a prolific, fertile, seed-producing plant. And this here is a picture of what I call Baccharis snow. I'm sure I'm not the only person who says that. And it's basically the release in a still environment, meaning no wind, of Baccharis female flowers and fruits. So it's gone. So that's Baccharis, but what about pilularis? So pilularis is Latin for small pill. And that might have derived from, different sources say different things. It might have derived from the pill-shaped galls at the end of the leaf shoot tips, as seen here on the left. Or it might be representative of the flowers and the discs shaped in the Asteraceae flower head, or the pill-like male flowers that are seen here in the middle picture. So I'll talk more about how they're male flowers and female flowers, but for now, you can see in the middle the male flowers, and the right are spent female flower heads with the discs left over. So pilularis might have originated from that. So today I will well, let me just say that even though Baccharis pilularis is the full name of the plant, I'll probably just call it Baccharis, even though it's technically B. pilularis. It's easier just to say Baccharis. And anyway, I'll clarify if I mean a different morphotype or be more specific at that point. So my outline for today's talk, or tonight's talk, is first I want to talk a bit about Baccharis biology and natural history. And that will be followed by a discussion of its role and importance on the landscape. And that's where I'll be talking about its role as a keystone species. And then finally, I'll finish up with Baccharis pilularis management, or different methods that land managers use when they have Baccharis pilularis on their landscape. So first I'll talk about Baccharis pilularis biology. And let's see. So Baccharis is an evergreen perennial shrub in Asteraceae. And I'm including this photo from Big Sur because I think Baccharis is the shrub that's everywhere, but you never see. So it's plain green, it's in the background, unless it's blooming, of course, then it's absolutely fabulous. But in this picture, your eye gravitates toward the waves or the flowers in the foreground. But what's in the middle here is a field of Baccharis and coastal scrub. So I like to think that it's sitting there in the background, so playing this huge supporting role of this community, these coastal communities. And we just need to stop and appreciate it more. Now, I know that I'm talking to a room full of plant people, and that you all probably love Baccharis as much as I do, but it's often underappreciated. So there are two morphotypes of Baccharis, which end up being subspecies. One type is called the erect type or tall type, and that has an upright stature. And the other type is the prostrate type or short type. And I'll use erect or tall or short or prostrate interchangeably during this talk. And then picture here on the right are examples of the tall and the short types. These pictures are from the Bodega UC Marine Reserve, and there is a common garden of short and tall Baccharis type morphotypes in a 100-meter grid. And I used that garden, that common garden, to compare the water relations of the two types. It was a great setup, and it's in the dunes just east of the Marine Lab. So here's a picture from Point Reyes on the Tamales Point Trail, and this was a great setup to have the erect or tall right behind the short version. So they do grow together on the immediate coast. And I should add that the common garden plants here, they were all comprised of plants that were located on the reserve itself. So no outside material was brought in. So they do coexist. So here is the range of both morphotypes put together. So here's where I'll introduce the names, the subspecies. So we have Baccharis pilularis subspecies consanguinea for the tall or erect type, and Baccharis pilularis subspecies pilularis for the short or prostrate type. This map is from CalFlora, and each blue dot represents a CalFlora submitted observation for one plant. And this is a map showing both types together. And these maps show CalFlora's observations separated by subspecies. So you can see that the tall type, the consanguinea, is within the coast range, and also a little bit into, here, I'll use my pointer again, a little bit inland. And it's located here because of the maritime influence comes in through the Delta Gap and lands and abuts up against the Sierra foothills here. So you do have a small population able to grow in that area. And alternatively, you have the coastal, the prostrate or short version, and that is really along the coast, restricted to the coastal sites. There are some observations here, and I would question those observations. I haven't researched those, but I'm very curious about why the coastal version is found, what these observations represent. So this plant is dioecious, which means that male and female flowers are located on separate plants. So you have a male plant with male flowers, or a plant with only male flowers, and a plant with only female flowers. They don't intermix. And pictured here on the top is a male plant, or the male flowers. They're staminate flowers, and they release their pollen. They typically have a yellow hue from the yellow stamens. And then on the bottom is a female plants here along a trail in Point Lobos. And they have long pappus that end up creating a very fluffy-like feature. It is interesting to note in my experience that males always bloom before females in an area, and short plants bloom before tall plants. So it was very interesting in the common garden to have all the short blooming for a full several weeks before the tall plants were blooming. And I found that same pattern on Mount Tam as well. So speaking of blooming, it blooms fall through winter. So it's a very late bloomer, like other Asteraceae people, plants. And this picture is from Point Reyes Field Station, looking right across toward the wilderness, looking west. The field station is in Olima Valley. And there's a beautiful stand of coyote brush and grassland right across the way. And this was during a rain event in November. So so Baccharis is wind pollinated. So the pollen from the male staminate flowers gets blown to the female pistulate flowers on female plants. And these are pictures of the umbrella-shaped pappus on the fruits that develop and eventually are blown up and out into the surrounding, I'll just call it a neighborhood. And studies have shown that the seeds can blow up to 100 meters away if the wind is right. So it's pretty far dispersal. I see we have some chats coming in. Are you okay if I continue?
It's fine to continue, Allison. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's see, and I would be completely remiss. Oh. Am I back? Okay. And I would be completely remiss if I did not talk about the root system of Baccharis. So Baccharis has an extensive root system. This here is a photo I took along the roadside of in East Bay Regional Parks. And I'm not sure exactly what happened here, but I was excited about seeing all the Baccharis roots come out. So the root system was studied by this guy. I have to give a huge shout out to this researcher, Andrew Wright. He was a master's student at UC Berkeley in the 1920s. And he did a wonderful and extensive study of Baccharis in the hills just above UC Berkeley campus in Strawberry Canyon. And I don't normally like to include quotes, but I had to include these quotes because he said, a shrub 35 inches high, dug up in its entirety, had a root penetration more than 9 feet below the soil surface. The roots were painstakingly undermined with a small ice pick. All right, I don't know about you, but that sounds like crazy amount of work. And not only did he dig it up, but he mapped it out on graph paper and then produced these beautiful plates, these drawings. And this is the one that this is a plate here of the one that he referenced in this quote here. And at any rate, you can see just how extensive the roots are. You can, let's see. Wait. So you can see in this image that it's kind of a dual root system. You have these shallow roots and then they go deeper. And the roots in the upper foot of the soil are also known as feeder roots. And they take advantage of shallow water sources, such as light spring rains or fog water. Baccharis has the ability to harvest fog on the coast, and it drips down below its canopy, and the roots are able to take it in. The deeper roots would obviously take advantage of deeper water sources and often groundwater sources. And also rainwater in the soil that hasn't evaporated yet. So there is a surprising amount of water in the soil pretty far deep down. And he also did this plate here of a younger plant to show the the root development at a younger stage. So yay, Andrew Wright. It's amazing the work that he did. So I also wanted to look at indigenous uses of coyote brush, and they would heat the leaves together and mash it together to create a poultice and apply it to swelling or upset skin, basically, skin problems. They would use the leaves to make teas to treat stomach issues and other ailments. And they would use straight branches for arrow shafts and also general construction that they needed. And this left me wondering if they actively pruned coyote brush to create those straight branches for use, because they aren't normally stick straight, but they do have straight parts. So let's move on to the role of Baccharis on the landscape and its importance in the coastal plant communities. So I've talked about or mentioned the keystone species concept, and this was an ecological idea developed first in the 1960s. And it mainly refers in the past and in literature, ecologists have referred to mostly animals, and further, mostly mammals. But the idea is that, just like in the picture at the right, that the keystone, if you remove it, the arch will collapse. So the keystone is of utmost importance in that figure or in that collection of items. And so Robert MacArthur, the famed ecologist, stated in a 1972 paper how keystone species could be defined by considering basically how removing it would produce a dramatic effect. In other words, if you remove the keystone of the arch or the species, it would have a dramatic effect on the community as a whole. And also, coyote brush can be pretty dominant on the landscape, but being a keystone species does not necessarily mean you're the dominant species on the landscape. So, well-known food web ecologist Mary Power and her colleagues pointed out that a keystone species is not necessarily the most dominant species in an ecosystem, but rather it's a species that has a large effect on the ecosystem's structure and function. So here's the charismatic little fauna that are typical examples of keystone species. You have the North American beaver, who create habitat, and also sea otters who influence habitat. They each are very integral into the food web, and are important to providing shelter, augmenting food sources, and dramatically altering ecosystems. The ecosystems alter dramatically when they are not present. So in the case of coyote brush does all that and more. So I will go through some of these, but it does all of these things. I won't just read them off, but they, let's see. So they provide shelter and habitat use by other species. They alter the habitat by invading grasslands and changing the structure. They are a food source. They provide opportunities for food for others. They affect nutrient cycling, and like think of those extensive root systems and how much carbon they're sequestering. And they affect the hydrological cycle where especially within the grassland, shrubland ecosystems. So I'll talk a little bit more about these. So first of all, if you sit yourself in front of a coyote brush, particularly one in bloom, and particularly a male coyote brush with all the pollen, you will undoubtedly see an amazing number of arthropods hanging out, all kinds, from spiders to insects. You'll see flies and bees, and at any rate, so there's a wonderful naturalist locally here in the East Bay named Mei Chen, and she just has the most astounding observations. And she let me use some of her amazing photos of the insects and spiders and that she's seen. And this is just a small examples, but anyway, there are dozens of observations. It's really wonderful. And then special to coyote brush, there are two insects that create galls for their larvae just on Baccharis. So on the left, we have Noramoschema baccharisella, and that's a coyote brush gall moth. And this moth lays its eggs on the stems of coyote brush, and when the eggs hatch, the larvae burrow inside the stem, which activates the gall. And this moth is 2.5 times more likely to create galls on the woody stems of tall or erect plants than the short plants. And then we also have the coyote brush gall midge, which is a very small, delicate fly. And this one is named Rhopalomyia californica. And this midge forms spherical galls by laying eggs between the bud scales of leaf tips on the leaf shoots. And when the eggs hatch, the larvae burrow in between the bud scales, and they release chemicals that then create the galls. And the galls are multiple chambered with one chamber per larva, and they end up pupating inside each chamber, and then eventually release as they chew their way out of 2 or 3 cells worth, a layer of 2 or 3 cells to release as adult midges. So that is a really close symbiotic relationship for these insects and coyote brush. And birds love coyote brush too. I've witnessed so many birds using coyote brush, but here are just a few that I'm sharing with you tonight. This photo on the right is a bush tit with flowers in its beak. And California quail often use coyote brush as an important shelter for it and its poults. And thrashers and scrub jays often call from high perches, as do California towhees and golden crowned sparrows. And the shrubs also provide these birds with important food sources with all those insects. Baccharis also is a source of shelter for deer mice and brush rabbits. And surprisingly, coyote brush is important to badgers, even though badgers are mainly known for being in open grassland areas. They do burrow near coyote brush because coyote brush shelters all of its prey. So badgers eat small mammals, and they range from rabbits and mice, like I showed you, but also voles and pocket gophers, squirrels, and they also eat insects. So coyote brush is sort of like the kitchen um, for badgers. And pictured here is a badger burrow that I found in the campground at Point Reyes Field Station. That was exciting. So back to keystone species functions, and Baccharis pilularis definitely alters grassland structure when it invades grasslands. So all those seeds that are that blow yards and yards away, they become established in open grassland and permanently alter the function of and the nutrient cycling, hydrology, all of these things. So, and also it becomes an important and biodiverse ecotone. So coyote brush also acts as a quote unquote nurse plant. And in Marin, this is particularly important in that it facilitates Douglas fir invasion. So at least on the slopes of Mount Tamalpais, the park definitely wants to maintain the grassland and maintain the ecotone of the grassland shrubland mosaic. But the grasslands are shrinking, grasslands are endangered worldwide. And one thing that they're looking at is the ability for coyote brush to facilitate the establishment of Douglas fir trees. And so here on the left is a picture looking west, and you can see in the middle here, there are some saplings of Douglas fir becoming established within the coyote brush stands. And on the right is a somewhat blurry, but Douglas fir saplings becoming established in coyote brush stands, and this is near Pantole. So it's an active area of research and management. And I should just mention too that this process of facilitating these species, Baccharis not only facilitates Douglas fir, but also in, say, the East Bay, Oak Bay woodlands. And so it's a natural part of succession. So eventually, if these Douglas fir become established, then this area here and here will eventually become mixed evergreen forest. So as I mentioned before, coyote brush harvests fog, and this is a activity near and dear to my heart. I love fog. I am entranced by it, and I think it's very cool to see plants harvesting fog. And anyway, Baccharis does not disappoint. On very foggy days, it will actively drip down to its canopy, um, uh, below its canopy, and the soil will be very moist. And that fog drip directly influences the shrub itself by enabling it to continue to compete and grow, compete with other shrubs and grasses and continue to grow. But also it allows the neighboring bunch grasses or annual grasses to grow. So fog is an important moisture subsidy during the rainless summer months. And research has shown, I believe it was in the 80s, that indicated that Baccharis seedlings survive best with late spring rains. And that's also the beginning of fog season. So as you get this fog drip happening, it's just a really key moisture subsidy at the right time to help Baccharis seedlings become established. That's actually one of the things that I studied in my research on Mount Tam in high fog and low fog areas. I looked at seedling establishment and how seedlings used fog water. And the short version is the seedlings used fog water when it was available. So they're definitely using it. All right, so let's move on to coyote brush management. And land managers, when they have coyote brush on their landscape, they have different goals, and they can have all of these goals in the same park or open space. But one goal is to, say, maintain the biodiverse ecotone habitat of the grassland shrubland mosaic, as seen here in this picture of near, well, the southwest facing slope of Mount Tam. This is sort of near, is north of the Muir Beach overlook. Parks and land managers also want to conserve view sheds and aesthetics. People like looking out over grassland to the ocean, as seen here, and have a different sense when it's all shrubland. So although it could be construed as some sort of artificial constraint, it is an important one in land management. And also important to consider is wildfire safety in the wildland urban interface. And I'll talk more about that later, but coyote brush, as I mentioned before, it invades grasslands, and it is very well adapted to fire, as you'll see in just a moment. So now that I've sung all the praises of coyote brush, now I'm going to go into how to remove it. And one method is grazing, another is mechanical, and then another is burning. So I'll go into, I'll describe these. So cattle grazing is a very common way to prevent Baccharis from invading a grassland. So cows will trample seedlings, and that generally keeps them at bay, especially with a high herd head count. I've also witnessed cows in Tilden Regional Park eating coyote brush. They've been browsing on it, which is very surprising. That was completely unexpected, but there they were, eating coyote brush. So cows are one way to keep coyote brush at bay. So is mechanical removal. Now, mechanical removal can be by hand, removing above ground, basically, I mean, removing above ground biomass. And above ground biomass can be removed by hand, by sawing at soil level, or it can be a more large scale endeavor like pictured here. So large scale mechanical removal like this, where they're using a masticator, can create very effective fire breaks very quickly in the wildland urban interface. This is important to consider, although it's pretty drastic, it's important to consider for human safety, especially during times of drought and after times of drought when things are very dry. Pictured here is the picture here is courtesy of the Moraga Orinda Fire District, which I've been consulting with, as Dave said in the introduction, in my introduction. And this is a fire break that they are creating using a masticator. And this machine is drastic and very cool, so I had to include a video. So it cuts it on the very end. And just creates a swath of, well, of no coyote brush. Oh. The fire district, after the mastication treatment, decided to reseed. They went to great effort actually to reseed with carefully chosen native grass and flower seeds, as seen here. So they're distributing the seeds. So fire is probably the best way to get rid of coyote brush, because it's a natural process. It retains the most diversity, and it mimics, it is an ecosystem process. It encourages nutrient cycling. But in order for Baccharis to die from fire, you need to burn the roots. And pictured here on the left is a shrub that is in the middle of a burn, and you can see one in the back here too. It was a pretty low intensity burn. Some of the above ground part of the shrub burned, but the shrub is still intact. There's still foliage on there that has not died. And you can see the green on this one as well. When I went back the following spring, this is what I found. And note that they did not seed in this area. These are all natural wildflowers in the foreground. And I'm not sure if you can see my arrow, but in these shrubs here and here, these are new shoots coming up. Some on existing stems and some brand new from the root crown. So I've had a lot of fun hanging out with Moraga Orinda Fire District on their prescribed burns. And I love coyote brush, but there's nothing like seeing coyote brush burn. It is just really cool. So here's some pictures of some burns. And these were all done in Orinda. This, just for perspective, on the bottom left here, that's Briones Reservoir. So here's a stand of coyote brush burning on a hillside. And here's a coyote brush burning intensely, and surrounding coyote brush not burning intensely. So I took this as a video, and you can just see it burning. So the main fire in the middle is a coyote brush shrub. And I'll pan to the left to a coyote brush shrub that was not killed. It burned a little bit, but the greenery, the green foliage is still present, and that will definitely grow back. So the one, let's see if I can, the one here will definitely die. The one here will stick around. let's go past. So here are a couple pictures of some shrubs that had their root crowns burned. And the one on the left, all the above ground biomass burned. And you can see the white ash on the ground, which is a sign of an intense fire. And what's interesting to me is it was very localized. So you have the dark gray area and the white ash area in the midst of some very green shrubs that were not burned as intensely. On the right, you have another shrub that was also burned quite intensely, shows some white ash. There is still some above ground biomass standing, but there is no grow back. There's no stump sprouting, and it's incredibly unlikely that this shrub will come back. And sometimes the roots burn so intensely that they continue burning underground. And in that case, you have a depression form where the biomass under the ground disappears and the soil compacts down. And these are shrubs that were not burned as intensely. They still have above ground biomass showing, and they are really fat and happy sprouts coming up. So that pretty much concludes my talk. I covered Baccharis biology and natural history, its importance on the landscape and the many roles that it plays, and also discussed Baccharis and how to manage it, and particularly its experience with fire. So I'd like to conclude by saying thank you, especially to the Marin chapter for funding my research and paying for processing my stable isotope samples. Much appreciated. This is a list of my other funding sources and my many field and lab assistants and assistants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Allison. There are a few questions in the chat, which we can go through before opening it up to the to other questions. Yvonne McHugh asked, from where does the common name arise of coyote brush?
I do not know. I don't know. It is much debated out in the world, and there's nothing in the literature about it. I have been wanting to contact Jepson Herbarium to start the path of who did the treatments and who came up with common names, but common names just sort of appear. But if you find out, can you let me know?
Allison, it might be easier for the question period if you stop sharing so we can see
sure.
more participants on the screen. Thank you. Martha Jackson asks, how can one know when buying seedlings whether the plants are male or female? Does a garden need both in order for the plants to thrive?
No, you don't need both. 98% of the nurseries will sell you a male plant. Hopefully they're selling you a male plant. Volunteers do pop up in people's gardens, but so they could be either. But generally, nurseries won't sell female plants. The reason why is because if they distribute the seeds, then before you know it, you'll have a whole yard of coyote brush.
Rowena asks, is it known or are there any strong theories regarding as to why native Douglas fir are rapidly encroaching on other native habitats? Since I was a kid, I have watched this occur dramatically in real time on the Bolinas Ridge and out at Palo Marin, southern PRNS. The hilltops were grassland and sage scrub, now almost entirely fir forest. Fire suppression, removal of ranch grazing. It is alarming and very sad to see the sage scrub, Northern California scrub grasslands, maritime chaparral disappear along coastal slopes. So,
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the question is,
well,
but
the question is
yeah,
the theories. Why are Douglas fir encroaching on other native habitats? Is this just succession, or does it have to do with global warming? That is a drying out of formerly wet areas that have favored Douglas fir? Those kinds of things.
right. Yes, it is succession. And I think the questioner nailed it on the removal of ranching or grazing, the removal, fire suppression, things that will remove these woody plants. And this has actually been a subject of research. There was a lab at UC Berkeley that looked at the role of fog in helping Douglas fir become established. And so even without coyote brush present, they just looked at fog, and they did this really cool experiment where they manipulated, they placed Christmas trees, fake Christmas trees out on the landscape as a way to um, create kind of a control of in the experiment of Douglas fir establishment. And anyway, the results showed that Douglas fir seedlings under Douglas fir that created fog drip um, became established very readily. And so fog drip definitely plays a role in the establishment of Douglas fir. But of course, something needs to be present to harvest that fog. So in my slides, I showed that Baccharis can do that, can harvest the fog and then facilitate a hospitable environment for Douglas fir seedlings into saplings. As far as the decades-long encroachment, that's a concern. It's an active concern, especially in light of not having as many grassland areas as we have had in the past. But I think that's an excellent point, and I can only imagine how it's been seeing it happen over decades in real time.
Artie Kirch asks, what month and year were those burns in Orinda, Moraga?
The burns were performed in either fall or spring. I don't recall the ones with the burned roots. I believe they were February or November. I don't have the exact dates. I know that I went to a November burn. The pictures of the stump sprouting back were in April.
Just kind of a related question that I have is, do you have any sense of what the germination rate was for those seeds that were sown on that duff, which had to be inches thick from the masticator?
Yeah, so I was part of a crew with East Bay chapter of CNPS who went out and did transects on that ridge. It's Bear Ridge in Orinda. And we have the data, and I am sorry, but I don't have the results offhand of the success rate, but I do remember counting out a lot of native grasses. Mainly Elymus glaucus. There were some Danthonias. No, not Danthonias. It was so long ago, I don't remember. I'm sorry. But
Confounding issue is that we know that there's a very long lasting seedbed of native grasses and forbs in very degraded annual grasslands. Witness what we see down at Kite Hill, which with mowing restored from native seedbed a beautiful pristine meadow. So it might be hard to tell whether it's the new grasses, the new seeds, or the existing seedbed
yes, I
situation.
agree. I agree.
Yvonne McHugh makes the comment, it's very fragrant when blooming, another wonderful feature.
Yes, some people think it's a love or hate thing. Some people's, oh, it's sweet like maple syrup, and other people say, oh, it's horrible like motor oil. I don't know.
Jim Normandi asks, have you studied mycorrhizal fungi associations with Baccharis?
No, I have not.
And Eva Buxton asks, would you call Coyote Brush a stump sprouter?
Yes, I
And
would.
Yvonne asks, again
But
on the,
but if I could interrupt, but it doesn't have a proper burl like say a manzanita does. It just has lots of a big root system that and a root crown that it can grow from. But if you cut it, it will grow up from the stump.
another question on the name. Might you know what is the name of Coyote Brush by the local indigenous peoples?
So I saw one resource. It is Puusen, and I don't know how to say that except Puusen or Pusen. And I have, that was from, my source was Friends of Five Creeks. They have a sign at an East Bay Parks meadow here in the Berkeley, Albany area, and they have that on their sign. I have looked for where they got that information, and because I was excited about it, and I haven't seen it. So it's Puusen.
Thanks. Sandy Pearson asks, I live in Orinda. The MOFD inspectors told me Coyote Brush is kerosene bush and insist that it be eradicated everywhere and repeatedly, wild and in native gardens. What's up with that?
Well, it does like being burned. It has evolved with fire, and so therefore it burns readily. And if your task, like MOFD is, to protect houses in the wildland urban interface, they're wanting to remove a pretty significant amount of coyote brush. So even, it's funny because I've been in contact and talked a lot about coyote brush with Fire Chief Dave Winokur, and he appreciates the plant as a plant and what it does and what it can do. But he also, it's sort of like his nemesis of just that thing is dangerous for fire, for out of control fires. So he wants to mitigate it as much as he can within reason. He doesn't want to eradicate it everywhere, but yes, in the wildland urban interface and key locations, he wants to make it safer for residents.
I seem to recall that on some fire safety pyrophytic lists, the prostrate form is okay.
Hmm,
Have you seen that?
I have not.
So I know in the areas of Ceanothus and Manzanita, there's an increasing sophistication, hopefully, of fire departments that prostrate plants are probably less pyrophytic than open, large, more erect plants of the same species, so that whole genuses don't get tarred with the
Right.
pyrophytic label. And we're trying to educate fire departments about that.
Absolutely. It's very hard to nuance fire lists like that. Also important is what kind of dead material might be retained within a shrub or plant shape. I happen to be the resident leader of our Firewise community in Berkeley. And so I'm very much into fire safety and what basically zone 0 and anyway. So I've looked into this at some point, but so for example, if you have like at my house, I have a silk tassel tree, which bloomed beautifully for the first time this year. And I was told that we needed to, we probably wanted to get rid of it because it's not up against the house. It's about 2 feet away from our house. But if I trim it up 2 feet and have it trimmed away from the house, it's significantly safer, and I take out all the brown leaves. It's significantly safer than, say, something on the ground that's catching dead leaves or retaining dead leaves on the ground. And I bring this up because I'm wondering about the prostrate coyote brush. I know that even though it's evergreen, it does lose its leaves, or a significant number of leaves every year, and that provides some of the shelter and nesting material for deer mice and such. And I'm wondering if that layer of leaves then provides too much or sufficient brown material, basically dead material, for fire safety underneath the shrub. On the other hand, the erect, the tall coyote brush will catch embers more readily and also has woody stems. So I'm not sure what the answer is.
Dana Pratt asks, when you speak about loss of grassland, is that in comparison to recent history or going back to the original landscape pre-conquest and pre-redwood removal?
Yes. I would say that overall grasslands have become threatened, and particularly California grasslands, both because of woody plant encroachment and because of development, human development. So, I mean, my focus has always been California plant communities and natural history, but I know that there are other parts of the United States and all over the world that are losing their grasslands due to woody plant encroachment.
Jeffrey Perron asks, is depredation by the burgeoning deer population of oaks playing a role in the expansion of Douglas fir?
I don't know.
Mike Mahoney asks, did any of the coyote brush resprout after mastication?
Yes. In fact, a lot of it did, because you're only removing the above ground biomass. You're leaving the root crown there. So unless the masticator was able to dig down under the soil surface about 8 inches or so, the shrubs were growing back. So it would be every 2 to something year treatment. It would need to be repeated.
Dana Pratt asks or makes a comment about the ecological value of Baccharis. I understand the Baccharis has over 400 pollinators. Given its flowering time at the end of our usual dry season, isn't it therefore filling in to feed these 400 insect families when they may be in great need at the end of the dry season?
Oh, definitely. It's a very important source for insects, especially during that time. It's a very vulnerable time because it's one of the only plants blooming. And it blooms prolifically. Wow, 400. That's a fantastic number.
Yeah, I've seen it on lists that say that after oaks, it's one of the highest rated keystone pollinator, or not just ecological value plants.
That's great.
It's way up there on the list. The list that folks like Doug Tallamy make
Right.
of ecological value. Yvonne McHugh says, I watched the slow demise of a coyote plant, but couldn't figure out the reason. If not limited by water and not destroyed by fire, do you know the natural longevity?
So coyote brush can, in theory, live indefinitely, but the above ground biomass, the boughs or bow, I'm not sure if it's boughs or boughs, but the branches, how's that? They last about 9 years. So they'll start like middle-aged plants, like 5 years old. They'll be big and bushy, and then they'll start growing and losing their leaves, getting woodier and woodier, and then you'll have these tufts of foliage at the ends, and then windstorm or just decay, they'll fall. And so on older shrubs, you'll have this collection of old branches underneath, and then you'll just start having this cycle of new branches coming out, and then older branches falling away.
I've found in my garden that after about 9 years, that happens, but also the whole root ball senesces.
Okay.
I don't know why. Um, Jeffrey Perron asks, what's Doug Tallamy's take on Coyote Brush?
I don't know that Dave
I,
just brought that up, so maybe Dave can respond.
well, I don't know whether it's Doug Tallamy or those that are using his methodology, but I've seen it very high on the list, right up there with oaks in terms of the number. And I think the previous comment about 400 species may have been from one of those lists. It's very valuable in terms of insect usage. Dana Pratt asks, and how do communities consider fire danger versus helping a diverse array of pollinators in these precarious times for insects? I'm curious how those behind the scenes in the world of native plants and fire departments are handling these difficult decisions.
They are definitely difficult decisions. It is a really big give and take, and it's not easy, right? I mean, you want to preserve as much diversity as possible, and the fire crews do too. But they also want to save lives, and in this era of possibly catastrophic fires, they really want to play it safe. And so they're making hard decisions about where they need to apply sometimes pretty drastic measures in order to keep people and their homes safe. So it's definitely, I fully agree, it's definitely not an easy thing. And in my experience, know that they don't take it lightly at all. They definitely, hence the reseeding and coordinating with CNPS East Bay chapter to get people, to guide them on what is the most diverse way to do these methods. I know Chief Winokur is incredibly engaged in this and is really wanting to kind of have the best of both worlds if possible.
Yeah, and I know from working with our own fire prevention agency that it's not an across the board prohibition. It's very much related to where in the property that plant is and
Yes.
how close it is to other plants and how well maintained it is. So it's not if it's done right, it's not completely simplistic. Unfortunately, the inspectors don't have enough knowledge about native plants to make sophisticated judgments always. But
Sometimes, right. Yeah.
oh. Neela White says on Panoramic Hill Trail behind UC Berkeley's Clark Kerr campus, there are many piles of coyote brush removed a few months ago, each with a paper tag with a number. Do you know if the piles were burned or simply left?
I don't know the status of those piles, but I know that piles are supposed to be burn piles. So they should be burned at some point, unless they come back and chip them. I'm not sure. But I know that in other parts of East Bay parks, they have um, burned piles. And I'm not saying that that is East Bay Parks. I think that's UC property. I'm not sure of the boundaries there.
Nick Bertulis says, is it common for oaks to recruit under Baccharis?
Yes. Especially coast live oak.
Dana Pratt asks, what is the average lifespan of female versus male plants?
Ooh, I don't know. Good question.
And asks, I imagine the number of pollinators benefits birds and species all the way up the food chain at the end of the dry season, hence keystone species. Yeah, well, I think by almost any definition, it's a keystone species, at least by Doug Tallamy's metric.
Yep.
Can you describe oaks recruiting Baccharis?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Well, I think it's a follow-up to the other one about do oaks recruit under Baccharis and asking for a description of how this happens.
Oh, um, I I would say it's the nurse plant idea that in succession you have pioneer species and secondary species, and each species then prepares the habitat in essence for the next round of species. And say where oaks are concerned, like here in East Bay Hills, you have, say, annual grassland, and if you don't graze it or if you don't burn it, then you have coyote brush magically appearing. And, I'm joking magically, but it appears. And then Baccharis then facilitates the transition into oak bay woodland. So it also facilitates um, bays to succeed into oak bay woodlands, and then eventually sometimes just to bay. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Joan Pont has a comment saying Greg Rubin, who, if you don't know, is a native landscaper from Southern California who has spoken to us uh, through seminars and things, says Greg Rubin studies native plants and fires and has published removing all plants leads and has published that removing all plants leads to increased fire danger with unchecked winds and no ember capture. A lightly irrigated native shrub can capture embers and reduce home loss. No protection from a huge firestorm, but to lesser conflagrations. Comment, not a question. Yeah, I've seen that PowerPoint that he's done of that, showing that where everything was cleared in a suburban development, the wind came through like a vortex and swept everything in its path. And where there was vegetation, it broke up those very high winds generated by fires. Jeffrey Perron asked, do deer browse coyote brush?
Do deer?
Yeah.
Yes. Not often, but they do. I mean, it's not their preference, but they do.
Yeah, I think it's on a lot of deer resistant lists for
Yeah.
that.
I mean, they'll nibble it, but it's not their preferred food. But, deer gravitate toward plants that are juicy, right? And have a lot of water content. And so coyote brush actually does. And so in the fall, when things are, peak drought and dry, coyote brush leaves are pretty juicy. So they don't, I mean, it's probably not noticeable, like say on Douglas fir, where you have these tiny bushes, of Douglas fir that they're so overbrowsed. It's not like that, but they do nibble.
Well, now would be the time if anybody else wants to ask a question in person and unmute, this would be the time to do it. Be a good idea to raise your hand electronically if you want. Otherwise, I think we're at the end. And Allison, I've learned so much about coyote brush and I've loved it. And I like it even more after knowing more about it. So thank you so much. Just
Thank you.
before you leave, I just want to tell you about next month's program. We're going to have a change of pace. This is going to be California botanical highlights in photos by 4 presenters. Vernon Smith, who many of you know is a fine botanical photographer, Madeline Kellner, Betsy Crawford. So this is going to be what I'll call an in-house program of some very good native plant photography. So I hope to see you all next month. Thanks again for coming, and we hope to see you again. Good night, all.
Thank you, everybody.